China is, by some measures, the world's biggest economy. An industrial powerhouse, it has flashy new cities and a burgeoning middle class. Mixing central planning with rampant capitalism, China's rulers have lifted 500 million people out of poverty. But the downside has been pollution, inequality, corruption, and political repression. Do growth and modernization have to come at the expense of human rights?
I cannot talk, I'm so sorry.
And what about democracy? I'm Mehdi Hassan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Zhang Weiwei, the best-selling Chinese author who says his country doesn't need and doesn't want liberal democracy. Tonight, I'll also be joined by Diane Wei Liang, a renowned novelist who participated in the student protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989, Dr. Martin Jakes, author of the best-selling book When China Rules the World, and Stephen Chan, Professor of International Politics at SOAS in London. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, our guest tonight, Professor Zhang Weiwei. He was Deng Xiaoping's favourite interpreter, and in his book, The China Wave, he fervently defends the Chinese political model. Weiwei, when you say in your book, The China Wave, which has sold more than 1 million copies globally, that it's, quote, unimaginable that most Chinese would ever accept multi-party democracy, I wonder, are you speaking on behalf of the 1.3 billion people of China, or are you actually really speaking on behalf of the 25 members of the ruling Politburo?
Well, it's really a common sense assessment. And actually, the greatest misunderstanding about China is about the Communist Party. I use equivalent something, the Chinese Communist Party would be very similar to an amalgamation of all major political parties in UK together. In the end, they reach consensus and work on consensus.
You've claimed that liberal democracy would be, quote, miserably wrong for China. Is liberal democracy miserably wrong just for China, or are you saying it's wrong for everyone?
I came to a humble conclusion. A non-Western country adopting Western political system usually ends up in two scenarios: either euphoria to despair, or from euphoria to anarchy.
How do you feel the Japanese feel about that, or the Indians, or the South Koreans, or the people of Taiwan, all of whom are in non-Western societies and happily enjoying liberal democracy, of varying degrees, but liberal democracy essentially?
In the case of Japan, its industrialization was not achieved under democracy. It's under imperial ruling system. With my respect, a lot of respect for India, I've been to India many times. You look at the gap between India and China. We start at a similar level. Now, China economy almost 5 times bigger. Life expectancy 10 years longer.
That's not what you said. You said that if you embrace non-Western democracy, you end up in anarchy. India's clearly not anarchy. India's actually only second to China in terms of poverty reduction. It's had a very good record of poverty reduction. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Yes, it's not doing as well as China, but it's not in anarchy, is it? It's perfectly happy switching governments.
Either two scenarios. The other, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, Liberia, the list goes on.
Yeah, although those societies are based on kind of foreign invasions and interventions. Whenever around the world dictators are toppled, people take to the streets. Have you seen any protesters anywhere in the world say, give us the Chinese system? How come it is that the rest of the people in the world don't seem to agitate? They do agitate for democracy, even in non-Western societies like Iraq, like Libya.
Agitated also by the Western media, which is still predominant in the world. But it doesn't matter. We believe the model cannot work in other countries, the Western model.
And here's my question. If the Chinese model is as good as you say, brings about competent leadership, why not trust the people?
We trust a lot of people. Yes.
A lot of people.
That's true.
Well, 1.3 billion people, you could trust 100, that's a lot, but it's
that's
not
true.
a lot
It's
relative.
more than the combination of total people population in the West. China's performance is better, arguably, than all the rest of Asia combined over the past 3 decades. especially on issues of greatest concern to the Chinese people.
You say China is distinctive. I think you talk about a civilizational state. Tell me what that is.
It refers to a case where you have the world's longest continuous civilization amalgamated with a super large modern state.
Okay. If your argument is China is too distinct, too different, too non-Western to be democratic, how do you explain Taiwan? Taiwan, which you regard as part of China,
yes,
they perhaps don't. 98% Han Chinese compared to China, which is 92% Han Chinese. So it's even more Chinese than China.
That's true, yeah.
Multi-party democracy, free press, 5 times the GDP per capita ahead of China. They're doing fine with democracy in Taiwan.
I'll give you another figure.
The civilizational state hasn't stopped Taiwan from being democratic.
Taiwan has a population smaller than Shanghai, 23 million.
Okay.
Do you know how many Taiwanese live, study, work in the Chinese mainland? 1.5 million.
Okay.
So it calls a vote by feet. As simple as that. I mean, Taiwan is a typical case of failure. You just look at the polls, how disappointed people are.
But you know and I know, and the Chinese government knows this, it's not one of the statistics that is rubbed out, unlike others. The number of protests in China against the government doubled between 2006 and 2010. There are now roughly 180,000, quote, mass incidents, good word, mass incidents every year in China. That's just the counted ones.
I can tell you that.
What are they all happy, all those people?
This affects less than 3 or 4% of the total
Okay, but that's because you're a population of 1.3 billion.
This
is kind of mathematical evasion.
Insignificant.
If 100,000 people protest, it's not that much out of 1.3 billion, but it's still a lot of people.
A civilizational state goes by its own cycles. The average cycle is 250 years.
So you just dismiss the fact that the number of protests has doubled to 180,000.
We handle their concerns carefully, seriously, but strategically, we affirm this political certainty.
Here's a question. You say we handle them carefully. Who's we?
I mean the Chinese government, the Chinese people in general. Yeah.
And the Chinese government's legitimacy, in your view, is based on the fact that it's a meritocracy and that it's growing the economy at a record pace.
That's one of the main reasons.
Let me ask you this then. Do you accept, for the purposes of argument, if growth stops, then the Chinese government's legitimacy, the Chinese model, is gone?
No, I don't think so. The point is, don't forget, the People's Republic of China is not East Germany. It's a product of 22 years of armed struggle. And after 1949, 2 wars with the United States, Korean War and the Vietnam War. Without general people's support, this kind of wars cannot be.
And are you ruling out democracy in China, liberal democracy in China, forever? Or are you saying at this stage in our development, it's not something we want? Maybe down the line.
No, we know West 10 times better in general than the West know about China. But we have about 3 million students studying abroad, 2/3 return.
With respect, that wasn't my question.
Yeah. As a result, we really look beyond the Western model. We have found so many problems.
Okay, so I'll take that as a no.
You have your strengths.
Okay, so I'll take that as a no. You're not a fan of it even in 50 years' time.
Transcend this model.
Okay, transcend the model. Well, on the current model, the model you have, why are there so many cases then these days of high-level corruption, high-level incompetence? You have Bo Xilai, very famous case, one of your top guys. He was tipped for the top, and now he's been sentenced to life in prison for corruption. If your meritocratic system is so strong and the basis for your legitimacy, how do all these bad apples get through the net?
No, actually, if you look at the history of the rise of major powers, including UK and United States, when you experience the high and rapid economic growth and explosion of wealth, corruption also goes up because supervision, the legal framework, cannot catch up with the progress of wealth. But gradually, things will improve.
Without a free press, for example, a totally free press, how can you hold a government to account? How do we even know there are not more Bo Xilais out there? It's totally arbitrary. The state, the party decides who is and isn't corrupt.
Compare China with other major large developing countries, transition economies, Russia, Ukraine, Egypt,
but why compare
Brazil?
With those countries? Why not compare with Western countries? You just said you're going to transcend the Western model. According to Transparency International's corruption index, which I'm sure you're familiar with, China is ranked as the 80th most corrupt country in the world, behind every single Western liberal democracy, including poor old Italy.
No, China is a huge country. It's equivalent to about the size of 100 European states. In average, European states is about 14 million. We have 1.4 billion. If you compare Italy or even UK with developed part of China, I'm pretty sure Shanghai does much better than Italy.
Okay, let's go to our panel who are here sitting listening to your views. Diane Wei Liang, you are a novelist. You're a former business professor. You spent part of your childhood, I believe, in a labor camp. And you were at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Wei Wei says that democracy is a Western ideal and therefore it's not suitable for a country like China, which is a civilizational state, which is a massive country. Do you agree with him?
Well, I do not. If you ask, why was there a million people every day on Tiananmen Square asking for democracy and freedom of speech, and over 100 million people in China demanding the same, and you stop and think, well, the Chinese people do want democracy, they do want freedom. It's not just about one person, one vote. It's not just about multi-party, but also about the rule of law. I know in your book, you said China is a society ruled by law. China is not. The rule of law means a separation between the legal system and the executive branch. Who would decide the law? If the president has a different view from the law, who has the more power? So the big question is not to ask the Chinese people, are you happy with how things are going? But give them choice. Would you rather live in a society in which you do not have any idea what is happening in the vital part of your political system? Would you live in a society in which if you speak freely, you would risk going to jail?
Okay, let Wei Wei respond to that.
China has moved along a lot. If you still say China does not have rule of law or rule by law, it will be a bit ridiculous. China is now world's largest property market. Without rule of law, people will not buy property. China is one of the largest countries attracting foreign capital investment. Without rule of law, that will not happen. So things are moving.
Let me bring in Martin Jakes, writer, academic, thinker, author of the best-selling book, When China Rules the World. I believe you were the guy who first came up with this civilizational state model. Is that something you agree with Wei Wei on? Do you think China's not yet ready for democracy right now?
None of the Western countries were democratic in the terms that you're using during their period of economic takeoff. Not one single one. None of them had a universal suffrage or a multi-party
China's at a different
system.
stage in development, so it's unfair to compare them in that way.
It's just silly. It's, it's naive, to be quite frank.
Okay, well, let me put the question to you that I put to Wei Wei. Do you think China will be ready for democracy later on, then?
Let me take you up there. You see, the point is then, what is democracy? Okay? Now, is China now the same as it was after the death of Mao? No, it's not. It's changed profoundly, not just economically and socially, but also politically.
Will China be ready for democracy down the line?
In the longer run, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Fair enough.
But I think that it will, whatever forms it finds, are likely to be of a distinctively Chinese character.
On that note, let me go to our third panelist. Stephen Chan is a professor of international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Is China, Stephen, in your view, a civilizational state which is so distinctive, as Martin and Wei Wei have argued, that it can't have these kind of Western conceptions or Western models of democracy?
I think that we're in danger of propagating a fallacy which the Chinese have long held, that somehow they're exceptional. And all through history, this sense of exceptionalism has continued right down to the modern day. A modern state partakes in international globalization. In this globalization, the Chinese are reaching out to the rest of the world. The Chinese cannot any longer pretend to be a civilized island unto itself. So I would deny the possibility, actually, of a civilizational state. If you're talking about long habitation, in fact, the two longest cities of continuous habitation on Earth are Aleppo and Damascus in Syria. No one calls Syria today a civilizational state.
Wei Wei, do you want to respond to Stephen's point?
Well, of course, you could have different arguments. When I say civilizational states, because China is perhaps the only civilization which continues for about 5,000 years. As a result, certain traditions are clearly there. For instance, meritocracy is part of Chinese tradition. I check, with my friends in Shanghai, do you want one person, one vote? Very few. Yeah. The current model is working better, much better.
With respect, your friends in Shanghai are exactly the most representative cross-section focus group. Diane.
The reason why China has done so well for the past 25 years, we've had meritocracy for over 1,000 years. That system stayed. China was prosperous until the 1500s. Then China closed its door and stopped trading with the world. Okay. China was in decline. And the last 25 years, China benefited a lot more from globalization rather than the so-called Chinese model.
Okay. You say, why should we take this one person, one vote when meritocracy is working so much better for us? Some might say because life is about more than economics. Life is about more than economic growth. Right. It's about human dignity. It's about self-respect. It's about freedom. It's about human rights.
That's true.
And that's not always protected by the fact that you have a great trade surplus or wonderful state investment. So on that note, you say in your book that China, quote, accepts prevailing conceptions of human rights.
For sure.
Let me ask you this. Liu Xiaobo, human rights activist, academic, author, 2010 winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. If I were to ask him, what would he say? Why is he sitting behind bars? He circulated a petition calling for human rights and democracy.
Is a person who openly advocates 300 years of colonization of China by the West. He hoped that will happen. His open statement.
So you imprison people on the basis of their hopes now?
No. This comment, this observation by Liu Xiaobo is a clear violation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So you're saying it's right to lock up people because they have views that the government doesn't agree with?
You just,
all you've given me is that he has a view that you don't like.
With the click of a mouse, you can find 10,000 pieces of criticism of the Chinese government. But you do have a rule of law. With regard to the radicals of radicals, they should be handled according to law.
In your book, 175 pages long, you make a single, solitary reference to Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, which killed up to 40 million Chinese. You make two references over 176 pages to the million people killed in his Cultural Revolution. You dedicate the book to Deng Xiaoping, your former boss, who was in charge when tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. How can you say that you are taking human rights seriously when you don't even seem to be interested in explaining, let alone defending, all these people who were killed?
Because this feels controversial, I mentioned many other examples. So it doesn't matter.
Millions of people dying under the system you're defending is not worth mentioning.
No. This is unfair. If you trace the rise of Western powers, the whole Indian, it's called a racial extermination in North America and South America.
And there's a genocide memorial museum in Washington, D.C.
That's true.
The Americans talk about that problem.
And the United States adopted the Chinese Inclusion Act in 1870s.
You don't
they
talk
did not
about
abolish
that problem
it until 2 years ago.
To you.
Why United States failed to do that?
Dan, you were in Tiananmen Square, as we mentioned earlier, in 1989. Martin has mentioned that progress has been made undeniably. Weiwei's talking about the past. Let's talk about China in 2014. He says there's a few, there's bad cases, big country, but otherwise it's comparable to the UK, etc. What's your response to that?
What's very interesting in Professor Zhang's book is that he redefines democracy, redefines human rights, and redefines everything. Why does China need to do that? Why is human rights only about economic development? Why is it not about the notion that all men are created equal, that nations are built on liberty and freedom?
Come back to that. Let me ask Martin that question.
The Western discourse, when they're talking about developing countries, and especially China, is to pay scant respect to the economic achievements. But both have to be taken into account. They're both very important. Economic rights, freedom from poverty, is the structure on which many of the other things are built. So it is absolutely fundamental, and that's obviously different from a Western country.
Do you think as they get more economic rights, i.e. bigger middle class, more wealth, they will demand more political rights?
Yeah, of course.
Is that what history teaches us?
I don't think we're talking just in the future. I think that's already happened. Now, with time, of course, as China becomes richer, as people have a better standard of living, as they have access to cultural facilities they never had, as the educational level improves and so on, there's going to be a dramatic transformation.
Let's bring in Stephen. How long do you think the China model, as it is with its human rights issues, shall we put it this way, can survive given what Chinese people are seeing the rest of the world enjoys in terms of rights?
Given globalization and given communications, given access to experience outside of China, I think the drive that Martin mentioned, particularly in the cities, for greater and greater freedoms is going to accelerate. So I don't think the present regime and its present disciplines can last. But I think that Martin made a key point here. When you do go to places like Shanghai and Beijing, yes, you can see progress. These are middle-class people in the great cities who are now enjoying more freedom than at any other time in Chinese history. This is not the case for poor people in the countryside, subject of land grabs and things of that nature, for instance, and it's not the case for minorities. So if you're a minority campaigning for certain rights of self-determination, you're not going to have those human rights.
Let me put that specific point to Weiwei there. Democracies are not just about majority rule, they're about protecting minority rights. Stephen mentioned minorities. In China, minorities perhaps don't do so well, you could argue. The Uyghur Muslim community in Xinjiang, they're not very happy about living under the current Chinese system. There's the Tibetans, of course. Since 2011, something like one Tibetan protester a week has set themselves on fire in protest at Chinese rule and Chinese abuse of Tibetan human rights. There's definitely a human rights issue there.
There are two issues involved. One is the sovereignty, the other is human rights. In terms of sovereignty, not a single country challenged that. Tibet, part of China. In terms of human rights, by Western perspective, the whole country, the Chinese political system is a violation of human rights. What can we say? But we think it's different.
If you're a Tibetan who's been driven out of your house, if you're a Uyghur Muslim who, according to Human Rights Watch, face ethnic discrimination, religious repression, cultural suppression, what are you supposed to do?
The case of gross violation of human rights in Tibet, that occurred during the Cultural Revolution.
So why are people killing themselves at a rate of one a week since
that's
2011?
all the statistics. There were plot behind this. It's not by Buddhism, people do not commit suicide. Yeah.
Do you think you're in a bit of denial
Buddhism.
about what's going
it's
on
not
in some
denial,
parts of
it's
China?
a factual. Yeah. We have so many people visiting. Have you been to Tibet?
There's huge restrictions on journalists visiting Tibet, funnily enough.
Journalism, you are tourist because you have some agenda, decent suspicion.
An agenda is called holding a government to account.
No. You
That's
have
my agenda
You
as a
want to
journalist.
overthrow the government of China.
I have no intention
way.
of overthrowing the government. I know
We
you think
are
everyone wants to overthrow the government.
United States.
Here's a very important question I'd like to ask you this. How many Chinese lives could be lost or would have to be lost to justify a single percentage of economic growth, a single percentage point? Is there a trade-off?
No,
Do you think as long as we get 1 or 2 or 3 points of growth, it doesn't matter if millions die in a famine or in the Great Leap Forward
China, you have
or in Tiananmen Square?
Have got the basics correct. In other words, first, China's achievement is the greatest, to be honest, in human history. 600 million people out of poverty.
I'm conceding.
300
I'm saying
million
the economic achievement is amazing.
No, with this
but
economic,
what is the cost? What's the price you're willing to pay for that?
No, the cost is there, but still, it's manageable. As with the rise of other powers, but we can manage them. We can eventually overcome these problems. No, the cost is indeed reasonable.
Reasonable. Okay, on that note, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back in part 2 of Head to Head, where we're going to be talking to our guest here tonight. We're going to be talking about China's role in the world. Join us in part 2 of Head to Head after the break. Welcome back to Head on Al Jazeera. We're talking about China and the rise of China with our guest tonight, Professor Zhang Weiwei, author of The China Wave. We're going to talk about China's role in the world. Despite America's huge unpopularity around the world these days, legitimately many would argue, given the Iraq War, Afghanistan, drone strikes, Guantanamo Bay, George Bush, and the rest. We know the record. The polls show that the US is still viewed more favorably around the world than China is. That's surely embarrassing.
Oh, it's okay. In the case of China, the vision is 10, 20, 50 years, not short pose. It's that's the advantage of China model. We can afford that.
And one of the pillars of the China model, you say in your book, is its non-aggression, its peaceful history and peaceful rise. But many would say, look at the region today, look at the recent tensions, Chinese ships ramming Vietnamese vessels, Chinese aircraft entering Japanese airspace. We've had a standoff between Chinese and Indian troops in the Himalayas. The Philippines regularly threatens to take China to court over naval disputes. Your neighbors don't seem to think you're very peaceful.
Actually, in East Asia, the economic relationship is booming and virtually all China's neighbors are China's largest trading partners. There are, historical legacies, territorial disputes, and with regard to Japan, you have to understand a bit this historical background. The Japanese government nationalizing the Chinese territory, that caused the problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you accept that these tensions and these disputes have grown in recent years as China's power, influence, economy, role has grown?
No, actually, I would argue perhaps it had to do with the role of the United States. The US is obviously receding in its overall power. It's deeply worried that China will overtake the United States. So I think the United States is behind the scene. It tries to encourage Japan and certain other Asian countries.
We've heard a lot from President Obama about the pivot to Asia. There's many people who say that the US views China as a threat, and that's the reasoning for the pivot. I wonder, does China see the US as a threat?
To my mind, to be honest, I think the United States should pivot to the United States, pivot to Arizona rather than Asia. Because the United States faces a lot of problems at home, crumbling infrastructure, underfunded
in answer to
schools.
my question,
That's true.
So China doesn't really see America as a threat because it's got so many domestic problems?
We think that China and the United States can live in peace together. We could have win-win solutions.
Okay, you talk about living in peace and China being peaceful. Why does it continue to prop up perhaps the world's most brutal, violent, despotic, closed country, North Korea, which is also a rogue nuclear power as well?
Well, this is a unique case because North Korea relation with China is something left over from the Cold War, and we were allies at that time. Actually, many people think we have a lot of influence on North Korea. It may not be so.
Fuel, food, weapons, you have quite a lot of leverage over
On the
North
other
Korea.
hand, if North Korean regime collapse overnight, that also cause a lot of problem.
So that's how you justify the Chinese.
You need to have a balanced way. Yeah.
Okay, let's go further afield to China's role in Africa. Just as Western governments have been rightly criticized for exploiting African resources nowadays, so too is China. Just as Western governments has been rightly criticized for propping up dodgy regimes in Africa with weapons, with aid, now China is being accused of similar things. Is the Chinese philosophy in relation to Africa basically we will give money, investment, weapons to any government, regardless of how bad it is, as long as they're willing to do business with us?
Here, two issues are involved. First, how average African look at China. Most Africans appreciate Chinese presence. With regard to China's alleged support for despotic regime in Africa, well,
it's not alleged. There is Chinese support for despotic regimes.
We have a kind of, we see China model. We put top priority to improving people's living standards, fighting poverty. So we do the same in Africa.
Yes, but they're also fighting each other, and you're one of the biggest arms sellers in that region, along with Western countries.
Actually, China's military aid to Africa is rather cautious. You have to examine case by case. Usually, if it involves direct confrontations between African states, China will refrain from giving military
no external
arms.
wars, internal repression, fine.
No, that's different. Business is business. It depends on perhaps United States supply. UK supplies more weapons to different countries.
I've already conceded that's not a good thing.
I don't have the figures
Two wrongs
with
don't make a
me.
right, do they? Wei Wei?
But the top 6 of the UN Security Council members are also top 6 suppliers of the weapons.
Okay, you mentioned people in Africa have very positive views, and the polls do show that, and there's been a lot of very important investment by China in African countries. But there seems to be a pushback. Listen to the former governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Lamida Sanusi. He says, we must remove the rose-tinted glasses through which we view China. He says, China takes our primary goods and sells us manufactured ones. This was also the essence of colonialism. Quite a strong charge.
Well, I don't know
African
when
figure.
he made this remark. China's involvement in Africa were already altogether 5 decades, if not longer. And if you look at 5 decades as a whole, China really helped Africa in building a whole new infrastructure. So this remark is unfair. Even for Nigeria, we build oil drilling facilities, railways for Nigeria.
So a lot of people complain that you also bring Chinese labor with you. You don't benefit local skills, local labor.
There is this kind of accusation, but indeed, in certain areas we do that. In certain areas we don't do. We create jobs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to our panel. Diane, is China a threat, a problem for its neighbours in the region? Some of those neighbours are quite agitated about China's rise. Are they right to be agitated?
Well, I don't think China intends to be a threat, but as China grows ever more powerful, I think it's inevitable when you have one neighbor is extremely powerful while you have other neighbors are not, the relationship will change, as we've seen in recent conflicts and tensions within Asia. And if we turn that on its head, I think China has used this peaceful rise rather selectively. China could throw its weight behind a lot of international issues more and to play its part, and as its obligation as citizen of the world.
Martin, you wrote the best-selling book, When China Rules the World. People in the West, for example, who read your book perhaps worried about this idea of being the dominant superpower. Are they right to be worried in your view? Do you buy this idea of a peaceful rise of China?
Well, I mean, there's no guarantee that China will rise peacefully, because it doesn't just depend on China, does it? Above all, it depends on the reaction of the United States. No hegemon likes to lose its position. And the Americans are, you can see, with the pivot to Asia and so on, seeking to resist this. Countries are looking at their future and they're saying, well, do we opt to go with the United States, or they're thinking in these terms, or China? And most of them actually are going to opt with China, because China is going to be so important to their economies. Meanwhile, America's economic role in the region is declining rapidly. And this applies, of course, to other continents. You've been talking about Africa. So China is going to be such an important player.
Before I bring in Stephen Chan, just for one last question to you. Do you think, yes or no, do you think China, when it does supplant America as the top dog, as the dominant power, will do a better job than America in that role?
Well, it's an impossible question to answer, but I think that it will do a very different kind of job, and in many ways it might be a better job.
Okay, Stephen.
But I don't, one can't be certain about it.
Stephen, how worried should the world be, not just China's neighbours, but the rest of the world, at the emergence of this new superpower that is China and the Chinese model?
I spent a lot of time in Africa. I've lived a number of years in Africa. I've been through a number of African wars as a peacekeeper, and advise African governments these days on investment packages put forward by the Chinese. In general terms, you do have a measure of genuine generosity and genuine help from state corporations, state enterprises coming out of China and trying to work with African governments. But there are very, very real problems with some of the contracts offered. So if there is a government that is still naive in its negotiating capacity, the Chinese are not above taking advantage. And I think there are recent examples in terms of platinum deals with the government of Namibia, for instance, which I advised against. But that went ahead because of political pressures.
And the global role, what about the anxiety about this new superpower, this new kid on the block? Should we be worried?
I think that the real problem is not about the state power of China, but about private entrepreneurs, private Chinese citizens going out to make their fortunes in other parts of the world and bringing with them civilizational attitudes that are not refined and attuned to the realities of the outside world. Private Chinese entrepreneurs, not government people, but private entrepreneurs in Africa have been largely racist.
Yeah.
Okay, well, on that provocative note, let's open up to our audience here in the Oxford Union, who's been listening to our guest tonight talk about China. We've talked about democracy, the economy, human rights. We've talked about its role in the world. Who'd like to make a point to our guest, Zhang Weiwei, tonight? Gentleman here in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Richard Bennett from Amnesty International. You may have heard of us, even in China.
With pleasure.
Xi Jinping says that he's cracking down on corruption. So why are people from China's New Citizens Movement, which has, through entirely peaceful means, called for disclosure of officials' assets in order to fight corruption, why are they being detained, tried, and imprisoned?
Well, I don't know exactly the cases you refer to, but I can tell you the overall background. In the Chinese model, it's very different from the Western model. The Western model is more or less, pinning on the society against the state. And the Chinese model is mutual interaction between the state and society. If you look at any opinion surveys in China, public order is always top one preference of the Chinese people. People treasure public order and stability. People thrive. Chinese are hardworking. If you are running a state as large as China, 1.3 billion people, you can make at least 80% population very happy. That's important. And then you try to fine-tune, gradually improve bits here, bits there. That's how the strategy has worked.
Has anyone in your family or social circle ever been arrested or detained by the Chinese authorities?
Most Chinese families suffered a lot during the Cultural Revolution, especially in big cities. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you look at opinion surveys, Chairman Mao is still very popular. Why? Because he unified such a large country. He liberated women.
Probably not popular with the people he killed. Let's go to somebody else in the audience here. Gentleman there in the third row to my right, yes, with the check shirt. Do you want to wait for the microphone to come to you?
And you talked that the so-called Western model could not be applied to non-Western countries. So if that's true, then what lessons can China offer to the rest of the world? And would you call those kind of lessons universal lessons?
No. The Chinese don't have this claim of universality. We are a very interesting group of people. We think if our model is good for us, we stay with it. We can compete with others. If others think our model is good, you can learn from us. If you think our model is not good, we don't care. Yeah, that's very different from the Western model. But indeed, if your model is indeed good, others will come to learn from you.
We'll take this woman here, and then we'll go to this woman here.
Thank you, Wei Wei. It's been a very provocative debate. My question is, how can or what can China do to help its citizens to form a civic identity, which is quite crucial to establish an effective democratic system? Or if you think Chinese citizens already have such identity, how would you explain that?
I wonder whether this paradigm, citizen movement, civil society, is necessarily good for non-Western countries. You look at the problem of Ukraine, Egypt, and the color revolutions. I've been to all these countries, whole Eastern Europe. I think, perhaps the Western NGO should draw some lessons, what you have done wrong. Otherwise, how can you convince others your approach is necessarily good? The Chinese approach is much better. If a society can build on consensus, it's a wonderful society.
You build consensus by cracking down on people who don't agree with you, by locking them up and calling them subversive.
It's a tiny radical modality. According to law, they should be punished. As simple as that.
Okay. Let's go to the gentleman. Actually, I said I would come to this woman here. Let's go to the woman here.
I'm Rahima Mahmoud, Uyghur ethnic from East Turkestan, so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. China's Strike Hard campaign have failed to create desired political stability in East Turkestan, as can be seen by the recent escalating violence. In response, the government has imposed stronger action of mass arrests, more public executions of Uyghur people resulting from speedy show trials, which does not deliver justice for the victims. The more the crackdowns, the greater the political violence. Should not China honor the agreements regarding the autonomy and self-rule in East Turkestan? Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, East Turkestan is a wrong turn for right place. Xinjiang is part of China. This territorial integrity is much more solid than United States' relation with Hawaii, or France's relation with Corsica, or maybe UK's relation with Northern Ireland. And yes, you have a point. There were people, supported by certain Western forces who want to make Xinjiang independent. But on the other hand, most Chinese don't agree. It's against international law, against Chinese constitution.
You say it's territorial integrity, international law, borders. Let's say we were to concede that. You would at least concede, though, the residents, the people of that area, are not happy with Chinese rule. They're not happy with the way they're treated.
Well,
and there are documented human rights abuses of Uyghur Muslims.
This is unfair, because you do not have statistics. I have statistics. However, I don't want to debate with you. it takes a lot of study to establish your argument. Yeah, it's not so easy.
So you don't accept that the people there are treated badly?
I tell you, I was in Kyrgyzstan, I was in the other Central Asian republics. Xinjiang, especially Urumqi, is doing much better than China's neighbors.
Okay, let's go back. I want to go take someone at the back of the hall. A gentleman there. Yep, you, looking around.
If meritocracy is what's distinctive, or one of the things that's distinctive about China, why is the Politburo and the Standing Committee, why are they both dominated by so-called princelings, people with family ties to early members of the revolution who've become wealthy from those family connections?
I don't know where you take this kind of information. I made a study, 85% of the Chinese top leaders, members of the political bureau, are from ordinary background. If you look at the party central committee, then it's about 90% from ordinary background. Even though so-called, princely, whatever, you look at their track record, they go through 35 years at least grassroots experience.
Does it bother you that in the socialist, communist China, where it's all about economic rights and equality, 83 billionaires sit in your parliament?
No, this is a completely wrong figure. But this kind of assertion that Chinese parliament is ruled by billionaires, it's just so irrelevant.
There aren't 83 billionaires in the Chinese parliament.
I can tell you the key difference between the Chinese model, political system, and the American political system is the richest 100 guys in China have no hope, no chance to influence the top leadership of the party.
You say that, and
in
yet
the United States,
and yet the top leadership,
top 30 will do.
And yet in the Chinese leadership, there are plenty of people who have enriched themselves along the way. There have been plenty of allegations against former Premier Wen Qiaobao's family, the current president's family. Yeah. They've all invested billions in mobile phone technology, in minerals, in property.
No, some allegations
on a Chinese government salary. How do they pull that off?
Some allegations may be right. Some allegations may be unfounded. So this is not a key issue. The key issue is whether...
We don't know because you don't allow the investigation to happen, do you? That's the problem. You don't have a free press to investigate that stuff. Let's take a question from a woman, please. Yes, here.
It's been over 60 years since China invaded Tibet. China's system of trying to Sinicize Tibet and stamping down on any activities it sees as threatening is doing nothing to quench the desire for self-determination. In fact, the suppression of human rights is actually strengthening the feelings of Tibetan nationalism. So do you think it's possible that the Chinese system can be flexible enough to come up with a solution that will be acceptable to the Tibetans? Or will China simply continue to try and rule by force?
No, if you compare Chinese approach adopted in Tibet with the European approach adopted in Americas in the history, no comparison. Did you notice most Tibetans today
straw man argument. We're not comparing China's... Come on, Weiwei. We're not comparing China's treatment of Tibet.
And Chinese court only allows Tibetan language for Tibetan citizens involved. Will that happen in Europe? Will that happen in North America? How many Indians can still speak a local language? They have to speak English.
Between 500,000 and over 1 million Tibetans are estimated to have been killed over the last 60 years.
100% wrong. You can look at
many.
You can check the statistics.
You tell me, how many Tibetans have been killed since 1950? Give me your number.
No.
You tell me how many have been killed.
You can check what's the population in 1950. What's the population today?
I'm asking you a simple question. The studies I've seen say between 500,000 and 1 million. You dispute that. How many do you say have died?
Well, this is a wrong question. How many Britons die? I don't know.
The question you don't want to answer is a wrong question. Gentleman,
I don't know the answer.
Okay, if you don't know the answer, perhaps you shouldn't question studies that have been done. Gentleman here.
My question to you is, who is going to protect the ordinary people if their interests one day goes against those of the state?
It's a hypothetical question. Actually, when I say China has a strong state, I always say strong and relatively neutral state. That's the key word.
Do you genuinely believe it's hypothetical that a citizen's rights clash with the government's?
No, it depends. We have, if you want to overthrow, if I look at the Amnesty International,
everyone
Human Rights
Watch. To overthrow the Chinese government.
No. Your TV program, even the BBC, a communist regime propaganda, the way you look at China, almost similar to how China look at West during the Cultural Revolution.
And yet hundreds of Chinese intellectuals, academics, dissidents have all signed all sorts of petitions and charters. This is not a Western conspiracy.
Tiny minority. sponsored by
When
Western
you have a billion
countries,
people,
by
everything's a
CIA.
minority. Let's go to a question from the lady here in the third row.
I'd like to ask about Sino-Japan relations. Do you think there is any area of cooperation which can ease the ongoing tension between China and Japan? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, if you look at the statistics, China and Japan should become brothers. We have so much, interaction and in terms of trade, in terms of human-to-human contact, etc. Okay. However, politically, I still, with my Chinese bias, blame more on Prime Minister Abe.
The lady with her hand up.
Thank you, Professor. I do not dare to tell you my name. That's how unique China's success is in terms of human rights, because some of my friends were just arrested and in prison recently. And I found your talk quite contradictory in three ways. First of all, you said China is very friendly with neighbor countries, but you just called Taiwan a failure. And you talk about average African person, citizen, how they see China as something positive. But what about the average Chinese citizen, how they view that government?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to come back in briefly there?
Yeah, I suggest you look at three surveys, PW, Gallup, and also Asia Barometer. They will give you the answer. Yeah.
Isn't it the case, though? I've got to ask this question at the end of this program. If we had a conversation like this in Beijing on television, if we had the kind of statements that were made about Tibet and democracy and locking up peaceful protesters on television in China, Diane or Stephen or members of the audience would get a knock at the door the next day, wouldn't they?
No.
You wouldn't be able to have this discussion.
I had a debate. Yeah, I had a debate with Professor Fukuyama, the author of The End of History. It's broadcast live. Still, you can check on the internet. We discuss each and every issue mentioned here, even more than that.
So, if anyone had said any of what they've said tonight on a public forum in China, nothing would happen to them in your view?
I don't know exactly, because I'm not. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay. Yeah. But you can check my debate with Fukuyama. Okay. He's more aggressive than you.
Me? Aggressive?
That's true.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Professor Zhang Weiwei. Thank you very much to our panel for coming here and offering us their expertise. Thank you all here in the Oxford Union for joining us. And thanks to all of you for watching at home. Head to Head will be back next week. Good night.